welcome to this narrated revision guide on the Nazi rule 1933 to 1945. And there we have just an overview of the course, and put it into context. Course Nazi rule fits in with paper 3 alongside the making of America. So have a quick look at some of the exam questions you'll be facing. Give you a little bit more detail on how to answer each of these questions, but it's worth just noting the wording of them. So question 6 and 7 start you off with a question about a single source for question 6, and then 3 sources, or rather one interpretation, that is an account by an historian, and 2 sources for question 7. And then you have a choice over 2 questions for the essay style question 8 or 9. As always important to choose which one you're going to select very carefully. Just a bit more specific advice on those. So for question 6, what can source A tell us about? What they're looking for is a very specific focus on whatever the key issues on the question. So as always, it's important to annotate the question first of all. You'd need to use quotes from the source or references to the source. It might be a description, and it'd be ideal to add your own knowledge to explain that further. You'd also need to talk about the source itself, what its strengths are, what its limitations. That's things like looking at the NOP, the nature, origin and purpose. Who did it? When did they do it? Why did they do it? What does that tell us about the source? Question 7 asks you how useful are a variety of sources and interpretations. And again, there's a specific focus on the question that you're looking at. And again, you'll need to use some own knowledge. Now, the advice here is to take each one at a time and make sure you use specific detail from the source or the interpretation, so a quote or a description. Again, add your own knowledge, making sure you're staying focused on the question specifically being asked. Use the NOP of the source, and then you'll need a short overall judgment using the collection of the 3 as a whole to draw conclusions about how useful they are overall. It might be that they're missing something, or they've got a specific focus, or they're looking at it from a specific angle. So always look at specifically what the words are in the question. And then question 8 or 9 that'll be something you're very familiar with. They'll give you a statement. You have to talk about how far you agree with this view. The idea here is to begin with a short, maybe 2-line statement yourself. Then you've got a 2-sided argument, although it's worth bearing in mind that they don't expect that to be necessarily balanced. It might be there's much more evidence for one side of the argument than the other. You're going to be using a peak style approach, so point, evidence, explain, and if you're going for the higher marks, complexity. And then you need to finish with a conclusion which gives your main reasons. So, and you'll always want to focus on the phrase, how far. Okay, on to the main focus then. So area 1, democracy to dictatorship. Now there follows a series of information about the key Nazi leaders. I don't expect you to know every single one of these in great detail, but it's worth having an overview of them and how far they played a part in Hitler's rise to power. Now obviously Hitler himself is very important in this, his charismatic speaking, everything that he wrote in Mein Kampf, which he wrote in prison after a failed coup in Munich. And he really learned from that coup and the idea of destroying democracy by using democracy. In that book, there was key issues that we'll see repeated throughout his reign as dictatorship. So blaming the Jews for everything that was wrong with Germany, ideas about Lebensraum, the idea of a living space, and the other key idea is the destruction of the Treaty of Versailles. Linked to the idea of the Jews is the idea of the Aryan race, the superior race, and a race that, according to Hitler, had a destiny of taking control. Many of those ideas were expanded upon by Dr. Joseph Goebbels, in charge of propaganda, using all the various means of new technology to spread that message, gaining power for the Nazis, an election campaign focusing on bread and work, appealing to the needs of the poor, basically appealing to everybody, anything that they wanted, and using that as a way, saying they're promising the Nazis would deliver a happier, better Germany, with Hitler as a godlike supreme being at the helm. Ernst Röhm's really important in this early stages, leader of the SA. He greatly increased the strengths of these brown shirts, of these stormtroopers, to intimidate voters, and particularly targeting the communists. In Hitler's original cabinet, Hermann Goering was second power to Hitler, and particularly in his role as being in charge of the Prussian police. And he would go on to form the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. Heinrich Himmler would rise to power predominantly in the second part of this. Key man for Hitler, he would go on to lead the SS, the protection squad, 200,000 member at the end of 1933, but goes on to be much more important after the end of the SA, after the Night of the Long Knives. Fanatical about our Nazi ideology, SS would run the concentration camps, they'd spy on people, although we know that are potentially exaggerated with the denunciations. In 1936, this is when he really gains power, in charge of the police, and in charge of other agents of potentially terror under Himmler's leadership as the Reichsführer and chief of all police. Wilhelm Frick, important in the original cabinet, but less important as we move on. And Rudolf Hess, deputy leader of the party, had to check off and sign all new legislations that followed Nazi ideology. And this is one of these men are all important. In terms of GCSE, some are more important, as we've highlighted just now. But the key thing is that Hitler had various of these acolytes, these men who were desperate to please Hitler, and that's how a lot of policy was formed, these men competing against one another to try to show the Führer that they were the one with the answers. So establishing the dictatorship, well, the key event that you'll without doubt need to know is the Reichstag fire in 1933. Hitler's only recently become Chancellor, and whatever the reasons behind it, whether this is an act of deliberate arson by the Nazis, deliberately orchestrated, or would they just get lucky, we won't know. But Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe is found guilty. The Nazis declare a wider communist plot, and this is key because it allows them to pass the Reichstag fire decree, which pretty much says if there's an emergency going on, Hitler needs emergency power, and it allows Hitler very early on to curtail civil liberties, which includes having to provide reasons for an arrest, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, secrecy of post and telephone, and in particular he targets the communists with these because of course he can link it to the fire, but the communists are also his greatest threat, his greatest rivals in gaining power. So 4,000 communists are arrested, including 100 Reichstag deputies, that's our equivalent of members of parliament, and the leader of the party, Ernst Thälmann, as well. Now, the key part of this is with the March elections approaching and the Nazis having a very slim hold on power, it's hoping that by banning the communists, by attacking the communists, by banning their press and banning their meetings and then generally disrupting their preparations, that Hitler would be able to take further power. So then we get the March elections, 1933, following quickly on the heels of the Reichstag fire. So the SA are used widely to intimidate other parties, particularly the Social Democrats and the Communists. However, this is a lesson for Hitler because he fails to gain outright majority and instead has to form a coalition using the nationalist DNVP party to give them the majority. And Hitler now realises from this relative failure, he has gained that majority with the help of the DNVP, but he realises he needs further power. So in March, later on in March, 24th of March, we get the Enabling Act. So with the communists still under scrutiny and under arrest, many of them still being locked up, the brown shirts, the SA, the stormtroopers surround the Krolleper Theatre, which is now being used for their equivalent of Parliament, whilst the Reichstag is out of use. Only 94 Social Democrats vote against the act. 444 members vote to pass it. And what it basically means is that for 4 years, Hitler is effective dictator. He can pass any law without the consent of the Reichstag. And again, it's it's shown to be an example of the emergency that Germany's in. We've got to give this the context of, for years now, since the 1929 Wall Street crash, Germany really suffering lack of employment, homelessness, chaos on the streets, and Hitler's using this together with his intimidation of the communists to say, I need this power now. It's a direct knock-on effect of the Reichstag fire, and Hitler never gives up that dictatorship. That 4 years continues because he now puts further restraints on his power, further stops the restraints on his power. So as part of this, the idea of a potential Nazi revolution takes hold. This is something that Hitler's been selling. So Gleichstellung, this idea of coordination, bringing everything into line. So in April, the Civil Service Act sees anyone who's non-Aryan, and particularly targeting Jews and anyone who's a political opponent, couldn't serve as teachers, judges, or university lecturers. So this means that he's able to change Nazi society to become Nazified from bottom to top, from top downwards. He's able to get rid of anyone who's had that influence. So he also targets the Jews. The number of Jews studying in university is severely restricted, and soon includes those who are lawyers or doctors. In April, we see a day-long boycott of all Jewish businesses. Brown shirts, you can see in that photograph, posted outside shops, intimidating anyone who tries to get in. And that includes attacks on people who did try to go and support the Jews. And people soon learned that if you wanted to keep yourself safe, you didn't support the Jews publicly. Same was still in the same year, to 25,000 volumes of un-German books targeting Jews and communists in particular are publicly burnt, as a gesture of publicly saying these people aren't fit to be in our society. We get further attacks by the SA and the SS on communists, social democrats, trade unionists. 600 murdered in 1933, over 100,000 arrested and sent to concentration camps like the new one at Dachau. In June 1933, this is supposed to be a legitimized regime. This is supposed to be bringing peace, but the Kopernik week of blood. Kopernik is an area of Berlin. There was a killing of 3 stormtroopers by a social democrat. We get 500 men arrested, 91 of which die under extreme torture. So the Nazis are making it clear you don't mess with us, and of course they're setting a pattern which would be followed throughout the regime. Now, trade unions is another potential opponent of Hitler, because if you can organise the workers to refuse working, that's been done in the past as a way of stopping the government. So initially on the 1st of May, Workers' Day, there is a day of national labour, but on the same weekend, on the same period of time, the offices of every left-wing trade union are raided. They take into the Nazi offices. They take their accounts. They claim that they're corrupt. They shut down their newspapers. They arrest their leaders, and everyone has to join now the Nazi-led DAF, the German Labour Front. So they get rid of trade unions in one foul swoop, really claiming corruption. Political parties follow soon afterwards. Again, they talk about fund corruption. They say the Social Democrats are a dangerous enemy. 3,000 party workers are arrested, imprisoned and tortured. And other political parties soon realise that there's no hope for us. If they're attacking the Social Democrats, it's going to be us next. And many of those voluntarily disband. 14th of July, 7 months into Nazis, into Hitler's dictatorship, into Hitler's leadership, they ban all new parties. And then they also attack new local governments. In 1934, so we're into the following year now, the Lander government, which try to hold up individuality for the independent German states. They are centralized. Instead, the regions were run by a Gauleiter, becoming Gau, a loyal Nazi who would make sure that they followed all new Nazi regimes. So there was no chance of independence away from the major cities. And because there was a real determination to make sure that political opponents could be got rid of, they didn't want that to exist, these people's courts are set up, because they didn't want to go through all the courts, even though they got the loyalty of the judges in many cases. These people's courts are set up. They call them political offences. The number of death penalties increases as the years pass, so they can get rid of opponents very, very quickly. You could be arrested by the police who are under the control of the Nazis and sent to a people's court where the judge would do the Nazis' wish as well. Now, this one now, Night of the Long Knives, gives you a slightly different twist on this, because at the moment all the focus has been on the Nazis' external enemies. By 1934, the SA under Ernst Röhm had grown to 3 million. In Hitler's eyes, he was a rival, and potentially was going to start his own revolution. Hitler was faced with, do I support the SA, do I support the army? And he decided that Rome was too dangerous. So the SS, the black shirts, are used to arrest the SA, the brown shirts, including Rome, who was killed at refusing to commit suicide. So the Night of the Long Knives wipes out that potential internal threat to Hitler. It also gives an opportunity to attack other people who he saw as a threat. So von Papen is forced to resign. He also gets rid of permanently some of his other opponents, Chancellor von Schleicher, von Kahr, who opposed Hitler in 1923, Klausner, a prominent Catholic. All of these are killed. 85 people, 12 of which were members of the Reichstag, were MPs equivalent, are murdered. The SA membership now falls and basically becomes relatively obsolete compared to the SS. And Hitler goes onto the radio. He doesn't hide this away. He makes it public. He calls them extrajudicial killings. He says he's done it for the regime. He's done it to protect Germany. The SS take over, and we see now the rise of Heinrich Himmler and a very strong culture of fear. Because if he can attack his own people, if he can attack the people who got him to power in the first place, surely no one is exempt. No one is free. His one remaining issue is President Hindenburg, who could, in theory, block Hitler's his laws. However, Hindenburg, who would be increasingly unwell and losing control, died on August 2nd, 1934. Hitler takes over the office of president and combines it with the office of chancellor to become the Führer, the leader of Germany. And from this point on, it's very, very difficult to oppose Hitler. So section 2, very famous photograph there. Why is it so difficult to oppose Hitler? Everyone giving the Hitler salute, one single man being brave enough not to. Why was it so difficult to do it? Well, we've seen partly that in our previous section. Let's look in a bit more detail about what the options were for those who wished to oppose. Well, the major thing is the threat of violence to yourself and to your family and to those around you. So we said before, the Night of the Long Knife made it clear, look, if he can do that to his own party, where else you go? The SS now grow in strength under Himmler. So from only 52,000 members in 1933 to, by 1940, by the time of the war, there was almost 1 million of them. Himmler takes control as Reichsführer and chief of all police, with his deputy Reinhard Heydrich also following up and being in charge as well of the SD and the Gestapo. Himmler's very famous quote, "The best political weapon is the weapon of terror. We don't ask for their love, only their fear." So the SD, the Secret Service, develops under Heydrich and becomes the State's Secret Service in 1938. So as we see this a lot with the Nazis, not that many full-time agents, only a few hundred full-time agents, but thousands of volunteer informants. They look at every aspect of society, including education, the arts, government and administration, churches, the Jewish community, looking everywhere for potential threats. They write and create and circulate to the Nazi Party extensive reports about the morale and the attitude. They're always looking for weaknesses and areas that they need to shore up. They look at how the changes have been greeted and they change their propaganda accordingly. So this works very much hand in hand with the propaganda, the positive side. The SD themselves don't take action against individuals, but they pass the information onto the Gestapo, who are able to take action. So Gestapo, the secret police, very, very famous, very well known and greatly feared. Their remit is to focus on any danger to the state, and paired with the SD under Himmler and Heydrich in 1936. Now, we do know that despite previous thought, the Gestapo only had 15,000 active officers. That's basically only one officer per 4,400 people. So for a town like Ludlow of 10,000 people, we're only looking for a potential of 2 officers. And yet it was still greatly feared. It targeted political opponents, but soon this would become Jews, homosexuals, religious dissenters, anyone who didn't fit in. They had the power to tap telephones and open mail. They used the Nazi system of block leaders, so local people in an area, there'd be one block leader who was responsible for checking on local residences, and that meant that everyone was potentially under scrutiny. We do know that denunciations were really important, so the public telling on other members of the public, and they investigated all of those. They did find that a lot of them would be petty squabbles, local squabbles, people taking out grudges. They would investigate them though, and they would get confessions through torture. They beat people with rubber truncheons or bamboo cane. The problem is we don't have that much information about the Gestapo because in the final days of the war, they destroyed all their papers, presumably in an effort to protect their leaders, to protect themselves. So we only get 3 sets of records. In these records, we do know that the sources for all arrests, over a quarter, 26%, came from the general public. Others came from the SD or the SS or the police, so that's 17%, and local Gestapo investigations mean 15%. So about 26%, over a quarter of all arrests, come from the public. That tells you an awful lot about how German society worked under the Nazis. There is, of course, the normal police at this time. They're centralised, they're increasing funding. We have the Orpo police, the ordinary police, and the Kripo, the criminal police. They provide intelligence and they arrest opponents. We've mentioned judges before. They had to swear an oath of loyalty directly to Hitler, and under the Nazi era, sentences become more severe. It's more likely that you can be punishable to death. So only 3 offences in 1933 to 46 offences by 1943 punishable by death. 40,000 people are put to their deaths. Many of them come from the People's Court with many show trials. That is, people would be targeted. They'd be warned, if you don't admit to this, your family is going to suffer. They would admit to it, and that would be publicly put out there as a way of how the regime was gaining control and making sure German society was cleansed, for want of a better word. So the concentration camps were where political opponents or anyone who wasn't trusted would be sent. Now, they were actually set up. 70 camps were set up in 1933, 45,000 communist and other political opponents were put in there. But to begin with, they were run by the SA and were very erratically run, so that actually people were dying because of the awful conditions. So much so that they actually closed them down in the second half of 1933, and Theodor Eicke was appointed to run Dachau in 1933. He did so with great efficiency that we would see with the Nazis in terms of the Holocaust. There was a strict code of conduct, specific punishments for different offences, and importantly, in 1937, Himmler declared that a guard could not be sent to prison for their actions. So, as a result, deaths in the camps dramatically increase, particularly at Dachau. Death rates increased 7-fold, for up to 69 deaths since 1937 compared to 1936. So, an immediate impact we can see there. Prisoners were used for hard labour, during which sometimes they would die, and we have a very clear categorisation. So it would be political opponents, there'd be the work, shy religious opponents, and Jews, and there was a very clear uniform with different coloured triangles designating different categories of prisoners. So by the start of the war, the number of prisoners was 21,000. It just gives you some idea of how threatening these camps were. And there would be the idea of being taken away in the night, and people not understanding why or where they got to, soon associated with these concentration camps. The fear of re-education, as it was seen, would have been great for the average German citizen. So hand in hand with the negatives, hand in hand with the threat of terror, there was the positives, or the emphasis on positives that was brought with the propaganda and Joseph Goebbels. Variety of means used, in fact, every aspect of society was really used to promote the positive things that the Nazis were doing and make sure that people thought in the way that they were supposed to be thinking. So in newspapers, there was the Nazis' own newspaper, the Der Stürmer. The editor's law meant that editors were personally responsible for all content, and therefore they could be held to account, and that meant they could be punished if a member of their journalist in the newspaper published something the Nazis didn't like. All journalists had to join the Reich Association of the Press, and they were often told what they could or what they couldn't print. Radio was increasingly popular. All radio stations were merged into the Reich Radio Company, and the Ministry for Propaganda managed what it said. They played Nazi speeches, Hitler's favourite composer Wagner, American jazz was discouraged. Cheap radio sets were made available for lots and lots of Germans. 1.5 million were produced in 1933 alone, so very early on. And by 1939, 70%, a huge number of Germans had a radio at home, the highest percentage of any country, comparable country at the time. So they really did push this message and the means to get this message as well. These great coordinated rallies, torchlit parades gave the sense of order and command, and the idea that the Nazis were fully in control of what they were doing. Biggest was Nuremberg. Events in 1934 lasted a week. 250,000, a quarter of a million people attended. There were 30,000 swastika flags, 152 searchlights, creating what they termed a cathedral of light. One of the most famous choreographed events in this is the Berlin Olympics in 1936. After Hitler came to power, 100,000 seat stadium was built and is still used today. Anti-Semitic signs were temporarily removed. They focused on the Aryan superiority. And teams, including Britain, gave the Nazi salute, rather undermined by the 4 golds won by Jesse Owens, an African-American athlete, who was famously shunned by Hitler, but actually was also shunned by his own president when he returned to America as well. Film was used extensively. In 1939, 2/3 of films were made with state finances. They stopped foreign films being produced because they import and export taxes. They glorified the leader. They criticised the Jews. However, knowing that this actually could be counterproductive to oversaturate the market, they were overly political films were limited to only 10% of total output. What about the opposition? You'll get this sort of question. Why was there so little opposition? Now, there's 3 ways you could go. You've seen this so far: the use of terror, the use of positive propaganda, and the opposition themselves. Now, it's interesting that actually with this threat of terror and this positive propaganda, there are 3 main groups that seem to oppose the Nazis, and all of them, 3 of them, for ideological reasons, and perhaps because they had reasons beyond their family to go against the Nazis. So we get political opponents, we get religious opponents, perhaps thinking of heaven as their ultimate goal, and we get the naivety and the idealism of the youth. So focusing on the political opponents, the left. We get 2 different stories here. The Social Democrats are left without clear leadership after the events that had happened before. The largest group was in Hanover, and he had 250 members. They produced leaflets, but they were hunted down by Gestapo. 1,200 arrested in the Rhine rural region alone. They could have been more effective if they joined with the communists, but because they saw each other as the enemy, they didn't do that. Now, the communists were something different. They were very visible. They had very clear meetings and propaganda. Their newsletter, The Red Flag, produced 19 million copies. But because they were so clear on this, they were very easily identified. They were arrested by the Gestapo. One of their members, the communist George Esler, attempted to kill Hitler, and that led to him being sent to Dachau for 5 years before being executed. So the communists were more effective, but because they were more effective, they were hunted down. So opposition from the church, well, you could have expected in Germany there to be significant opposition because there were 22 million Catholics, 40 million Protestants. But Hitler, in one swoop, really reduced that potential threat when in 1933 he made an agreement, the Concordat, with the Pope, which basically promised they wouldn't interfere in each other's affairs. And too late, the Pope realised that Hitler was going to stick to that. The Protestants actually welcomed the Hitler in many ways to start off with. They set up a new Reich Church. They swore an oath to Hitler, but Hitler interfered in both. And by 1939, all church schools were closed, and priests who spoke out against the Nazis were arrested. So individual leaders. Well, the most famous individual leader is Niemöller, Protestant pastor. He formed the alternative non-Nazi confessional church, had 6,000 pastors of a total of 8,000 in Germany in wider terms, had joined with the church preaching against Nazi racial policy. More than 800 pastors were arrested and sent to concentration camps, including Niemöller, who survived Sachsenhausen and then Dachau. Following the steps of Niemöller was Paul Schneider, joined his church. He was arrested in 1934 and 1935. In 1937, he even went as far as to ban outwardly Nazi parishioners from his own church service, and he was imprisoned in Buchenwald concentration camp and murdered in 1939. So you can see the pattern here that there is opposition, but it's being snuffed out by the Nazis or sent to concentration camps. Pope Pius realised by 1937 his contact was going nowhere, so he wrote a leaflet, a letter with burning anxiety, was read out in church services, although the Nazis again got onto this and raided every church. Cardinal Galen, very powerful man, initially welcomed the Nazis, but by 1934 he criticised the Nazis' actions, too high profile to remove, so he continued his criticism, although he was put under house arrest. His most successful achievements was in 1941, where he preached sermons against the Nazis' T4 euthanasia program, which included the killing of disabled and mentally handicapped children, and that forced the Nazis to stop their euthanasia program. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to comply, refused to give the Nazis salutes. As a result, they were very much targeted. 6,000 were imprisoned in concentration camps by 1939 after being targeted by the Gestapo for this reason. And then finally onto the youth groups. So we have communists disguising their meetings as hikes. 1,500 people joining these Mutten or gangs, and often they were dressed differently. They wore check shirts, they wore bright scarves, they wrote anti-Nazi flyers. So they were scrutinised by the Gestapo and under constant threat, but provided some alternative, some opposition. By 1933, there were 2.5 million members of the Christian youth. Some continued to meet and to go on illegal pilgrimages, even though this wasn't allowed. Got the swing kids who didn't conform. They listened to swing music. They had long hair. They listened to American music. They had white trousers. Many of us were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And then a group specifically against the Nazis, the Edelweiss Pirates, were formed in 1938. They wore their pin, they sang anti-Nazi songs, listened to foreign radio. Some attacked the Nazi youth, and some were executed as a result of their actions. You can just notice a lot of these aren't working together, and that's really because it was very difficult to coordinate opposition, because coordinating opposition meant communicating, and communicating meant you were under scrutiny, and you could be denounced or you could be investigated by Gestapo and you'd be sent to concentration camps. So we have the combination of the fear, the terror of the Nazis, the positive propaganda, and the opposition being very disunited, very divided. So how did the lives of the German people change 1933 to 1939? We're going to look at a few groups within this section. I'm going to start off with looking at workers. So famously, by 1939, from almost 6 million unemployed people in 1932, at the time the election that saw Hitler came to power, there was almost hardly any unemployment at all. 35,000 out of a total of 25 million men. However, we know the reality is very different. For example, that didn't include a focus on Jews. It didn't include a focus on women either. Also, though, one of the major issues for the Nazis is that they really made a big emphasis on this idea of blood and soil, the need to have farmers, the need to provide food and produce for the German nation. And this focus led to the Reich-entailed farm law, forcing farmers to pass their land on to their older sons rather than divide and sell it. And the idea behind this was to keep farmers going, to make sure that they kept farmers going. But actually, many people left to go to the cities, and the rural population had fell from 21% to 18%. So actually, under the Nazis, there were less farmers available. Industrial workers made up 46% of the population. The Nazi obsession with environment made industrial jobs plentiful, and employment rates did soar. However, we need to bear in mind that within that, wages were frozen at the 1933 levels, and at the same time, prices rose, and people had to pay the Winter Relief Fund, which for an average family was 3% of their income, meant that even those in employment, even those with these jobs, didn't have enough to feed their families easily. So there wasn't that comfort, despite the jobs increasing. We saw earlier about how Germans had to go to the DAF, the German Labour Front, the Nazi version of the unions, and they had to pay membership. That was obligatory. So 29 million members of that by 1939. Now there were a number of different Nazi policies focused on making work a pleasant place to be. So Strength to Joy, Kraft durch Freude, or KDF, meant that there were subsidised holidays, so there would be discounts on trains, on hotels, cheap theatre tickets, gym evenings. Each one of these includes an ideological content delivered by the party, so there'd be lectures on cruise ships. But many people did take up these offers. So in 1937 alone, 1.7 million went on package tours, 7 million took short excursions. The Beauty of Labour looked to improve workplaces, new toilets, changing rooms, showers. The Reich Labour Service, this is a controversial one, provided cheap labour with state projects on the new motorways. So by 1935, 18 to 25-year-olds they were obliged to serve 6 months. So that provided free labour. They provided with a bit of food and with a uniform, but the free labour building the new autobahn, the new motorways, being controversial because they didn't have any choice about it. One of the positives, the Volkswagen scheme, the people's car, in 1938 meant that workers could pay 5 mark per week and eventually receive a new car. Never happened because the war happened. And the overall point about this is, despite the focus on the Nazis, on work and Strength Through Joy and the positive work experience, there's so many initiatives that many of the workers who, remember, hadn't got much money felt harassed. And by 1939, there was clearly a growing disillusionment with the Nazi regime in terms of work. Now, the women formed an important part of Nazi regime and ideology. They were supposed to appear without makeup or perfume. A woman was to have some strength. She was to focus on the 3 Ks, the Kinder, Kirche, so children, kitchen, and church. They had to save their leftovers. There would be a one-pot Sunday. They were supposed to be physically robust. So they could bear children. They were expected to join the Nazi Socialist Women's League, which had 2 million members by 1938. Offered meetings, and there was a magazine focused on domestic duties. And this really was the Nazi idea. There's a job as a woman is to provide a family, to look after your men, and to make sure that they can do their job for the nation. They offered loans for women and for men to get married, which saw the couple offer 1,000 Reichsmark worth of goods if the woman gave up their work for the period of the loan. And it would take 8 years to pay back. So that meant that effectively they wouldn't be going back to work for many women. However, that would be reduced for 25% for every child, meaning if you had 4 children, you wiped out the need to repay the loan, and women did take up this offer. So in 1934, 250,000, 250,000 loans were issued. Now, because of the demands of making sure with the war economy, that in 1937 the need to go at work was cancelled to increase the rate of marriage and births even further. Divorce, interestingly, was made easier so that many women who were in a marriage where they were unlikely to have children could divorce more easily and find a new couple, again with that focus on increasing the birth rate. Now, the major restriction was on higher education. Only 10% of all university students were allowed to be women. This really backfired on the Nazis by the 1930s because the country needed highly qualified women. They had them before, and they needed them again to take on the work caused by rearmament. However, women were reluctant to go back to the universities, having been discouraged since 1933, so that really didn't work. The amount of marriages did increase, 560,000 in 1932. So 500,000 in 1932, almost 750,000 by 1939. There was an increase initially in birth rates, but actually it had dropped by 1939 to 3.3 per couple. When compared to 1932, which is 3.6, actually they dropped. They'd done worse than what they started with. The amount of women in employment did increase, although that's not surprising in a booming economy. So there were 4.6 million women in agriculture by 1933. By 1939 it was 4.9 million. In industry, the figure rose from 2.7 million to 3.3 million. So there were more people in work, more women in work. Young people, another key part of the Nazi regime. So Bernhard Rust, the Reich education minister, saying the whole function of education is to create Nazis, and that certainly seems the case when you analyse their policy. So Nazis took power in 1933. Anyone who wasn't a politically reliable teacher was forced to resign. 13% of head teachers were fired in Berlin. Jewish teachers were clearly banned from teaching in non-Jewish schools, and they had to join the Nazi Socialist Teachers League. 97% of teachers joined it by 1936. Political education courses ran for teachers. Pupils were encouraged to be spies upon their teachers, and reported any teachers who taught anti-Nazi jokes or non-Nazi material. There were also some Nepala or military academies run by the SS, and also Adolf Hitler's schools, which were supposedly to produce leaders of the future, but because they had such a priority on racial and physical criteria, so you could only get into it if you looked a certain way, they were largely a failure. Only 6,000, just over 6,000 people schooled at the 16 Nepala and 10 Adolf Hitler schools by 1939. So it won't be any surprise that the curriculum focused on Nazi ideals: history, the superiority of the German and Aryan race, blaming Jews for World War I, geography, the look into Eastern Europe and the need for Lebensraum, firearms in physics, maths, social arithmetic, so examples of what the costs of keeping mentally ill patients alive. RE was greatly reduced in strength and became optional in 1937. PE made up 1/6 or 15% of all lessons, focused on being fit, and in biology they focused on how Jews were inferior, how women could choose Aryan husbands and why that was a good idea, and the idea of Untermenschen, how some human beings were inferior to others. Youth organisations. So even out of school, there was no escaping from this. They became compulsory after 1936. By 1939, they had to attend meetings. All other youth groups were shut down, so that the young people were forced to join it and could access sports and facility and activities through these youth groups. They focused on indoctrination, physical activities, their political songs, their parades through towns. The boys experienced very militaristic. There were Morse code tests. Girls groups focused on domestic duties, military nursing. There were these holiday camps, which for the working classes would have been fantastic, a chance to get away from the cities and physical exercise. 1935, membership for 10 to 18-year-olds was 48%. By 1939, it was 82%. So notice there's still 18% of people who aren't going to these groups, even though it was compulsory to attend meetings as well. Some people hated all parts. Some people loved it but hated the ideological parts. And interviews with former youth members suggest there was a mixed reaction, but for many, they liked the activities, that the organisations were emotional, but they were inconsistent. You never really knew what you were going to get. Finally, on to Nazi racial policy. So Mein Kampf emphasised the Aryans as the Übermenschen, the master race, and many leading scientists believed that they could focus on this, that the Aryans were the most superior group, being the Northern group, blonde hair, blue eyes, and this is an exaggeration, but that's what they focused on. That non-Aryans were inferior. The Untermenschen included black people and Slavs, who they called the Dunga folk, or dung people. The lowest group of this were the Jews, and this wasn't down to belief, that you couldn't stop being a Jew by not going to a synagogue, but it was actually down to your ancestry. So the Nuremberg laws of 1935 stated that anyone with 3 to 4 grandparents who were Jewish was also Jewish, and then if you had 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents, you were called Mischling, or half-Jews. The Nazis believed all sorts of nonsense, like that Jews and gypsies could be identified by large noses, and they measured people's noses to aid their research in this. They spread widely misinformation, such as that the Jews are to blame for the loss of World War One, that the anti-Semitism was widespread. Actually, they were mostly integrated. But Germany was dominated by Jews, when in fact they were 0.5 million of a population of 67 million, and that Jews were common as well. As in fact, that's a total myth. Actually, Jews formed the full spectrum of political parties, including some initially being Nazis. We get the persecution of the Jews starting with the boycott of Jewish shops, as we mentioned earlier. It became commonplace to see signs with Jews not wanted here by 1935 in public places and restaurants, in parks and shops. Increasingly over this time we get physical persecution. Nazi newspapers produced cartoons. Jews were portrayed as paedophiles and rapists. The gift pills, the toadstool, portrayed Jews as a poisonous mushroom killing a whole village, a whole city, or even an entire nation. In 1935, this was written into law with the Nuremberg laws. Marriages and extramarital sexual relations between Germans and Jews were punishable by imprisonment. Jews weren't citizens, but they were only subjects, and therefore didn't have the rights of German citizens either. After Kristallnacht, it became clear that the Jews were going to be physically persecuted as well. So after an assassination of a German embassy official in Paris by a Jew, Goebbels took this opportunity to tell Nazi parties, youth groups, the SA, the SS, to demonstrate against the Jews. We get 267 synagogues destroyed, 7,500 Jewish homes established and the windows smashed. At least a minimum of 91 Jews were murdered, according to our records, but there was a high number of associated suicides, so-called suicides, and rapes at this time as well. We also get the first rounding up of Jewish men. 30,000 were sent to concentration camps, which is the first time that this had been done en masse, and we get very few people going against this. Now, we get over this time period a slowly wearing away of the Jews with a number of laws. So looking at social exclusions to start off with, we get very early on Jews and the Aryans not allowed to pay together. They had to add Israel and Sarah to their first names. Their passports were stamped with a J. They couldn't buy newspapers or go to theatres by 1938. They're banned from swimming pools. They could be evicted from their homes by 1939. And then a curfew is brought in September of 1939 as well. So they couldn't leave their homes after a certain time. They're treated as the enemy, and their rights are slowly eroded. Equally, they aren't allowed to go be part of education. Race studies becomes part of the school examination system. They weren't allowed to gain doctorates. They couldn't go to Jewish schools from 1938. They're banned from universities in the same year. Jews were excluded from the most important jobs and the jobs with influence. So judges in 1933, vets, journalists in 1936, Jewish doctors not allowed to practice on Aryans in 1938, and by 1939 they couldn't be dentists or chemists or nurses or any other medical posts. They hit them financially as well. They had to tell how much wealth they were using to help Germany by 1938. They couldn't run businesses by 1938 as well. Had to hand over their jewels and the silver and the pearls in 1939. And if they did want to emigrate after Kristallnacht, they couldn't take any valuables with them. 282,000 Jews did emigrate from Germany in 1933 to 1939, but they had to pay a very heavy emigration tax. So people often ask, why didn't they just flee? Well, many of them thought, well, it can't get any worse. And they knew they were losing so much by doing so. So many chose to stay there and hope it would get better. And of course, sadly, it never did. Many of them really sadly, like Anne Frank, fled to neighbouring countries like the Netherlands, only to be caught later by advancing German armies and be subject to the same persecution they were fleeing from in the first place. Right, so section 4, what was the impact of the Second War on the German people? Well, if we look at the beginning of the war, there's some similarities what we know occurred in Britain. So we get blackout regulations in the first morning of the conflict. Often children are sent to live with their relatives. Children in the cities given gas masks, just like had been in Britain. But then we get these great successes happening with the German troops taking Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, France, and Britain's airfields even being targeted. December 1939, Hitler announced a war economy, something they've been planning for some time. Military expenditure rose dramatically. It was already pretty high. So 23% of goods produced were related to the military. By 1939, it had gone up to almost 47%, with 55% of the general workforce now employed in war work. So you can see there's a significant change there. However, the war economy really struggles, and this is largely because there are different military groups: the SS, the Wehrmacht, that's the army, the Luftwaffe, the air force, the navy, and local Nazi leaders all trying to get their way. And as a result, the economy actually is greatly inefficient and lacks centralized control. The war economy really didn't exist by 1941, as each of these tried to fight against each other. So this changes with Albert Speer taking control. Albert Speer, Hitler had great faith in. He takes control of armaments and war production by February 1942. Hitler said to Speer, Speer, I'll sign anything that comes from you. So Speer did a combination of different things, really. He tried to get the economy to look after itself, so industrial self-responsibility. Factories were given responsibility, but they had control maintained from a central planning board. Industrialists were encouraged to join, and he excluded the military personnel who had argued beforehand. Speer made sure that factories focused on a single product rather than a variety. He employed more women. He used concentration camp prisoners as workers, and he excluded skilled workers from compulsory military service, so that he made sure that the products were high quality. The result was significant. So tanks, we can see there, go up from 1940, got 1,600. And by 1944, there was 19,000, so an increase of 3 times under Speer in 2 years. Aircraft from 10,000 in 1940 to 40,000 in 1944, again 3 times under Speer in 2 years. Civilians suffered, again, just like they had in Britain. January 1940, we had a terrible winter, worse so than in Britain. Temperatures rarely above 5 degrees Celsius, ice and snow meant it was impossible to travel. There was a lack of coal. Businesses, schools, beer halls, cafes were closed. People foraged for firewood in parks. They wore outdoor clothing inside. Anything they do to keep themselves warm. Rationing was introduced from the start. A really complicated system. People allocated points. No one really understood what it was. It was reissued each month according to supplies, and no one really knew where they stood. Jews had ration cards marked with a J. They had a much lower allocation. Very limited hours to shop, often just before closing when most of the goods had gone. And queuing and complaining became common. But if you did complain, you were likely to be punished. Women, Speer wanted women to work, but Hitler actually refused this. So women were never actually conscripted into work, as they were doing it in Britain. From 1939, women under 25 had to complete 6 months in the RAD, just like men had to have before that. Most of them worked in agricultural jobs. The restrictions on marriage loans were lifted so that women entered the workforce. We had almost 750,000 women were in war industries. By 1939, it had risen to almost double that by 1941, but 30 million was the total population, so most were preferring to stay at home. So again, the Nazis paying the price for their previous policies. By spring 1940, the RAF were bombing industrial areas and Berlin itself. A massive program of air shelters was begun, just like there had been in Britain. We see the KLV program, which saw voluntary evacuations of the countryside. But if you were below 14, you could go for 6 months. If you were under 10, you could accompany by your mother. Conditions varied enormously. Fear of Nazi indoctrination, however, led to only 40,000 of the 260,000 eligible children in Berlin participating. So people were worried that if they sent their children away, they'd come back and knock themselves. So they didn't let them go. They'd rather take the risk of staying there. So that tells you something about the effectiveness of Nazification. Now, opposition clearly rises to the Nazis during the war years. So we get to the most famous example is the von Stauffenberg bomb threats, Operation Valkyrie, emergency order to allow the plotters to use the reserve army to remove the SS and the Gestapo. The bomb did go off, but a heavy table leg and the fact that they'd gone from a concrete bunker to a more open space due to the summer heat meant that Hitler survived. The conspirators were arrested and executed. Public criticism, no, so active opposition here, although not going as far as to be active rebellion. Galen, I mentioned this earlier, he made 3 famous sermons in 1941 denouncing the terror of the Gestapo, the taking of church property, and the execution, the euthanasia of mentally and physically disabled people. They distribute sermons. They distributed them around. The Catholic preachers who were caught doing it were murdered, and Galen, who was too powerful, as we said, was placed under house arrest for the rest of the war. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Protestant pastor, preached against the Nazis. He joined the German resistance, joined Abwehr, sent messages to the resistance. He has helped organise the escape of Jews to Switzerland, and was arrested in 1943. Continued to preach to inmates and was killed in Flossenburg concentration camp in April 1945. One-off case, and it's the only example of Jews being saved by a public protest, the Rosenstrasse. 27th of February 1943, part Jewish men, so Mischlings, were taken and held at Rosenstrasse. Their Aryan wives maintained the protests, and although deportations did continue, they did secure the release of some political prisoners. The White Rose Group, a youth organisation. Remember, we talked about the idealism of the youth earlier. Sophia Hans Scholl were the leaders. They were influenced by Galen and what they heard about the treatment of Jews during the compulsory service on the Eastern Front. Their 5th leaflet in January 1943 appealed to all Germans, saying Hitler can't win the war. Up to 9,000 leaflets were distributed in 9 large cities around Germany. Their final leaflet, after the Nazi failure at Stalingrad, sought active resistance at a time of low morale. It was reported to the Gestapo at university by the caretaker there, and they faced the People's Court and execution. Otto and Elise Hampel wrote over 200 postcards asking people to resist military service and to stop donating money to overthrow Hitler. Nearly all of the 200 postcards that they distributed were handed to the Gestapo, showing how far people were scared of the Nazi regime. They were tried by the People's Court and executed in 1943. Active resistance, ultimately failure because of the fear of the German people. There was passive resistance. One woman repeatedly wrote 1918, talking about the fact that Germany had been defeated in World War I and would be again, on notices and posters, but it was covered in thick black paint each time. Soldiers returned from the east, talking about the Nazi barbaric treatment of the Jews and the Poles, and people started to turn against the Nazis, and the Nazis took a tougher line. We don't really know how much the people knew. We know that they feared persecution. We know that propaganda sold the myth of Hitler being the saviour. Bunker building welfare schemes focused the people's minds. Some may have been persuaded to continue to support the Nazis, but we'll never know how far people in their minds were opposed to the Nazis. Grumbling increased, but it's hard to measure precisely how much. So the Nazis from 1943 are clearly beginning to lose this war. They lost to the Russians at the Battle of Stalingrad. They were pushed out of North Africa by Britain and France. So we get the Total War speech. Goebbels' speech talked about a total war, a shortest war, demanding people be willing to work 14-hour days, and a real radical total change, asking people to do everything they possibly could to win the war. It was played on radio, it was shown in cinemas, posters were distributed supporting the idea of total war. Finally, perhaps too late, 3 million 17 to 45-year-old women were finally called upon, although of those only 1 million responded. All non-war related issues were eliminated. Magazines closed, professional sport was ended, clothes rationing ended and replaced by exchange centres. So everything was focused on winning this war. Air raids took their toll on Germany. 40,000 died in a bombing firestorm in Hamburg in 1943. There were attacks on Berlin, causing almost 4,000 deaths. 0.5 million were left homeless, 100,000 were injured, but with much of Berlin destroyed. It continued into 1944. We had the D-Day invasions. Paris was liberated in 1944. The Soviets entered Romania and Poland, so they're starting to come in from the east. Many fled to the countryside, whilst the Allies advanced with many refugees, which increased again the pressure of fuel and food. And the Nazi regime responded by increasing the amount of arrests and summary executions. in 1944. And then after the bomb plot, the Stauffenberg bomb plot, 7,000 were arrested. The Hitler salute became compulsory for the first time. It was absolutely obligatory. Many had volunteered to do it, many chose to do it, but now it was compulsory as the Nazis began to panic. Goebbels was made the Reich trustee for total war. 0.5 million workers became soldiers and were replaced by untrained workers, decreasing production, so it had a knock-on effect. Women were allowed to do compulsory service up to the age of 50, and they used foreign workers. In places like France and Netherlands, they used foreign workers who now made up an amazing quarter of the workforce, 7.6 million. Again, to save the resources, railway and postal services were cancelled. They shut down theatres and opera houses and music halls. Propaganda was further strengthened. People were warned about what they said in public. Everything was geared to this final push. In 1944, October 1944, near the end of the war, the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, was created, which included all males, including injured soldiers, from the age of 16 to 60 who were not in military service. They got only 4 days training. They had no uniform. They had only an armband. They were given old rifles and captured foreign weapons. So they're very poorly prepared. By 1945, February 1945, 25,000 killed in the Dresden firebombing, destruction of the medieval city there. Berlin was defended by 80,000 Volkssturm and Hitler Youth against an overwhelming odds of 1.5 million Soviet soldiers. Hitler took his own life on the 30th of April 1945, and Germany fell apart. The shops were already out of food. There were massive food shortages that led to starvation. Germany surrendered. Thousands took their own lives. Thousands were raped by Soviet soldiers advancing from the east, with hospital records revealing official figures, and this is only official, many of them wouldn't be reported, of 90,000 to 130,000 rapes in the weeks after the surrender. Kershaw has argued that a combination of terror, positive propaganda, and a belief in this man who had seen as a saviour of Germany had held the regime together until the bitter end, and once he had gone, it really fell apart. So section 5, occupation. What did Nazi rule mean for the different people of Europe? So just to start off, always interesting to see it from a British perspective. We have here just some examples of Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands, and the rather haunting photograph there of a British policeman and Lloyd's Bank with Nazi soldiers marching through the area. So Channel Islanders, 4,000 of them, a population of 66,000, were sentenced for breaking the law. 570 were imprisoned. But the largely refused to help to be part of Hitler's defensive Atlantic Wall, and so the Nazis had to bring in slave labour, which included 4 concentration camps built in Alderney for 16,000 prisoners, of which 700 died due to harsh treatment. Amongst the islanders themselves, some women had a relationship with the Nazis, others created underground newspapers or wrote anti-Nazi graffiti. So a range of different responses. Right, so what we're going to start off by looking is how, this is one of the key exam questions, is how the Nazis treated various different areas of the occupied Nazi empire that was created. And we start off in the east with Poland. So we need to bear in mind that Poland was very much seen as Germany's to take over, as part of the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. After the invasion in 1939, they wanted pretty much to destroy Poland, including its culture, its government, and to Germanize the country, to make it a part of Germany. By October 1939, so very early on, Poland had pretty much ceased to exist. It had been divided into 5 different regions, with the largest area in the middle known as the general government. So they wanted the general plan that were going to apply for the rest of Europe. They were tested in Poland. Polish or Slavic people, who were seen as Untermenschen, were removed as soon as possible and replaced with Germans. Hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens expelled, and they brought in 500,000 ethnic Germans to settle in their houses and in their land. So it was a wiping out of Poland. As part of this, and the terror that followed under Gauleiter Hans Frank's German government area. Schools and universities were closed. They arrested 30,000 intellectuals, political leaders, and tortured or murdered them. The Slavic Poles were seen as racially inferior, and it wasn't just the Jews. There was almost 2 million non-Jewish citizens were killed, and 1.5 million deported to Germany as forced labour. As the Jews had to wear the J or the Star of David later on, Poles had to wear a P on their arm. They were paid a lower wage, and sexual relations, just like the Jews, was banned. The Jews themselves were concentrated in ghettos, and 3 million of the 3.5 million Polish Jews were killed in death in concentration camps. So the Polish did fight back. There was a delegatura, a secret state in Poland was established by the government, which had fled to London. And towards the end of the war, the famous Warsaw Uprising saw 2 straight months of rebelling against the Nazi rule. It was ultimately unsuccessful, and it led to the complete destruction of Warsaw. Patients were shot in hospitals, 200,000 people were killed. So the Nazis clearly got their revenge for that. Very, very different story in the West, in Netherlands. The Dutch government surrendered in May 1940, so not that much different to Poland. Again, they escaped in exile to Britain, as did the Dutch royal family. The Dutch also had a Gauleiter in charge, so Arthur Seyss-Inquart. They did get rid of democracy, and the parliament was dissolved. However, and this is the big difference here, the Dutch were seen as sharing the same ethnic background as the Germans, so civil servants were allowed to continue, although it should be noted that around 1/3 of all Dutch mayors resigned. And the Dutch education system was left alone because they didn't want a backlash. So in this early period, although they got rid of democracy, they didn't want to rile the Dutch. They didn't want to create a rebellion. In the early stages, the Dutch showed compliance. So civil servants were asked to fill in an ancestry form because they wanted to get rid of Jewish elements, and nearly all of them did so. There were small amounts of resistance. The Prince Bernhard's birthday was celebrated. Carnations were worn in support of the Free Dutch, and in response, there was a response which wasn't too great from the Germans. They removed royal portraits, they changed royal street names, but no one was actually punished. Now, the turning point happens in 1941, 1942, and so we get into February 1941, and for the first time we get Jews being rounded up. So 425 Jews are rounded up for deportation. Dutch communists called for a strike. 9 were killed, hundreds were arrested in protests, and from March that year we see the first death sentences against Dutch citizens, with 3 strikers and 15 members of the Dutch resistance being shot. This is the start of the resistance and the beginning of a different treatment of the Dutch. So by 1942, Dutch Jews already had to wear the Star of David, and then in 1943 we get intimidation increasing. This is largely because the Germans start deporting Jews to extermination camps in huge numbers. 76% of the total Jewish population in the Netherlands, 107,000 Jews were deported. Now, that was partly because of the compliance of the Dutch, or actually because the Dutch population was concentrated in a small urban area, and a large part, it was difficult to hide. And then the second stage, not only Jews, but 300,000 Dutch former soldiers were transported to work in Germany. We saw earlier how eventually up to 1/4 of the workforce of Germany was made up of foreign workers. Strikes in protest of this led to 95 being killed and 400 wounded. Then we've got 18 to 35-year-old men having to report for forced labour. Only 54,000 of those did so. 170,000 should have done so. Only 54,000 did so immediately. But by 1944, all men aged 16 to 60 had to do so, with around 500,000 being forced to comply with this, which is around 1/3 of all eligible men. At this time, Dutch resistance clearly develops. 300,000 are going into hiding by 1944. We get illegal pamphlets, we got armed attacks on registry offices for ration coupons and blank identity cards so they can carry on living their lives. 20,000 resistant workers were arrested, most of which are sent to Dutch camps, and we have 2,000 Dutch resistance fighters were executed. Late in 1944, as the Allies start moving across Europe and trying to free up Germany, we got rail workers go into hiding to stop the transport system. There's a severe lack of coal and food, with severe food shortages, and 20,000 Dutch actually die of starvation. Netherlands was liberated by Canadian soldiers in May 1945. And you've got there on the top right the diary of Anne Frank, a German who had fled to the Netherlands and was, of course, discovered by the Nazis. Now brings us to the Holocaust. During the Holocaust, it's estimated around 11 million individuals were murdered, of which 6 million were Jewish, but there were also Slavs, Gypsies, communists, homosexuals, and various others. 1939, there had been 9.5 million Jews in Europe, mostly in the East, and in keeping with Nazi philosophy, in keeping with Hitler's philosophy, as seen in Mein Kampf, they decided that this needed a solution. Now, the question you may receive here is, how far was this a planned action? To begin with, the model that they came up with, the first solution was to persecute, yes, but also to allow emigration, and this is known as the Vienna model. So in Austria, the first policy was to force Jews to leave the country, to get them out of there. And after the Nazi invasion, Jews were beaten, they were humiliated, they were looted, they took their property off them. But many were considered and promoted to emigrate through the Central Office of Jewish Immigration. And 110,000 of a total of 167,000 Jews in Vienna, and of a total of almost 200,000 Jews in Austria, emigrated in 2 years. This was known as the Vienna model and was to be repeated in Czechoslovakia the next year. So in this very first early stage, yes, there's persecutions, yes, they steal their money, but actually the focus is on deportation, forced immigration. Now, one of the issues with this is Poland, really, because there's such a high population of Jews in Poland. They realised that an emigration plan wouldn't work in a country with 3.5 million Jews. So they move all the Jews to a reservation area. And although they considered deporting the Jews to the Soviet Union or Madagascar, they didn't yet control such an area. So instead, they concentrated the Jews into ghettos until this would be possible. So that plan was still something that was being considered. There was a huge ghetto in Warsaw, 3-meter high walls, barbed wire, almost 500,000 Jewish inhabitants, which is 1/3 of the city's population, in just 2.4% of the land. On average, 15 people shared a small apartment. Disease and death was common. Not surprisingly, outbreaks of disease such as typhus in autumn 1941, and 140,000 people die in the ghetto in horrific conditions. Phase 3, the third solution, is murder. And not the murder by the death camps yet, but by these groups known as Einsatzgruppen, and these task forces. There are 4 task forces, A, B, C, and D, but up to 1,000 men in each. And the sad story of taking the Jews to secluded wooded areas, forcing them to strip, dig their own graves, and then shot. And of the areas where they operated, around 1 million Jews, 90% of the total in these areas, were murdered in the autumn and winter of 1941 to 42. So a more sinister step has now taken place with the dealing of the Jewish problem, as it was called. They realised that actually this process was inhumane, as they would call it, not for the Jews but for the executors. So they started trialing different methods. In the Chelmno camp, they trialed the murder of Jews through exhaust fumes in camps, with the hope that this would have a less psychological impact on the SS killers. There wasn't a location found for the Jewish reservation, so this provided a solution. So from autumn 1941, Operation Reinhard saw the deliberate execution of Jews in the general government area of Poland. And they set up extermination camps, deliberate extermination camps, in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. murdering Jews in these newly constructed gas chambers away from the large towns, and with only in each of them only 20 to 35 officers deliberately to try to maintain the secrecy. You can see those camps on the right hand side in the east part of that image on the bottom right there. So they would be herded onto these trains like cattle, often using cattle trains. In fact, they'd be sent to a shower block, and they would be gassed, and then Jewish slave labourers would be forced to bury them or burn the bodies. The Jews themselves have been told they're being resettled, but the rumours soon spread about it. At Sobibor, in 1944, the Jews did fight back, and 11 SS guards and were killed, with 300 Jews escaping, but these were sadly isolated examples of resistance and couldn't change by the fact that by 1945, 1.7 million Polish Jews had been murdered in these death camps. Now, this had been trialled, and as far as the Nazis were concerned, had been successful. So in January 1942, the Wannsee Conference, this was where, although very little was written down that was clear on this, they decided to lay out the plans under Heydrich of the gassing of Jewish people. It included really precise numbers of Jews in each country, in each area, and even included plans for British Jews. Adolf Eichmann, a senior SS officer, was put in charge of this. And this was known as the final solution to the Jewish question. The most famous, arguably, of all the Jewish extermination camps was at Auschwitz, which now became a death factory. It was originally a labour camp. Experiments using Zyklon B began in 1941, September 1941, and it was so successful that actually it was overrun with prisons. So a second site, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, was created with 4 gas chambers and a crematoria. 75% of those arriving were immediately gassed. Some were sent to work, those deemed fit enough to work in the associated factories as slaves. And they even included Sonderkommando, special unit groups of Jews whose job it was to get the bodies to be burned. They're very proud of their efficiency in this killing, in this slaughter, in this murder, with 12,000 Jews murdered per day. An estimated 1.1 million being murdered at Auschwitz, which is equivalent to around 1/6 of all Holocaust victims. With the Russians approaching and Germany looking to lose the war, Himmler ordered the gas chamber destroyed, and they didn't want to just leave the Jews, so 58,000 were put on a death march towards Germany, long distances, thousands dying on the way. But 20,000 of those were actually liberated at Bergen-Belsen in Netherlands by the British in April 1945. How did different people react to this? Well, if we look at one example in France, so we have in the north we get the occupied zone, and in the south we get the free zone, the Vichy France led by Pétain. Occupation in the north, there was anger because of the swastikas and because the Germans plundered food. There was strict censorship. French had to be in their houses by a certain time. French workers were taken to work in Germany, as we've mentioned before. Many refused to leave. After 1942, over 70,000 French Jews were deported to death camps, sadly, with many French being part of the Vichy government, taking part in the administration of this. People did take part in minor acts of resistance, listen to the BBC, helping them resistance. Those who actively resisted the Nazis built an execution chamber in Paris. They were making it clear that they weren't to be messed with. We've got 2 examples here of responses to German occupation. So André Chocmé is a pastor in southeast France. They'd done small acts of resistance, so they refused to read an oath to Pétain, the French leader who was in charge of Vichy France, the collaborative French. He was active in trying to liberate Jewish, mostly children, hiding them in homes and hostels, finding them identification cards, helping them to flee to Switzerland or hiding them in the mountains whenever they heard that the Vichy police or the Germans were checking on what was going on. In February 1943, Chocmé was arrested, released on a lack of evidence. By 1944, Chocmé and other villagers had saved around 5,000 Jews. So an active resistance there in the southeast. By way of contrast, Coco Chanel, the famous fashion designer and perfume maker, stayed in Paris when the Nazis arrived, began a romance with von Dinklage, a German military officer, and even used her position to unsuccessfully try to remove Jewish directors of a perfume company using new anti-Semitic legislation, anti-Jewish laws. It's been claimed by the historian Hal Vaughan that actually she was potentially a German spy and had used her close friendship with Winston Churchill to try to negotiate a peace, and that maybe she was active during the war years, but the Allies covered it up because of her friendship with Churchill. So a very contrasting example there, and it's up to individuals to decide how far someone like that is guilty, or is it just an example of someone making their way and surviving in this world, or is it treason effectively? How do you see that? So a few examples of how the Nazis were greeted in different areas. In Denmark, they were given favourable trade relations, so the government could later, by bargaining, reject legislation against Danish Jews. In France, we get guerrilla warfare, we get underground newspapers. They deliberately helped to push the Allies, help the Allies to push the Nazis out of France. In Monaco, a very interesting one, they turned over foreign refugees but protected their own Jews. In Croatia, we get extreme political party, the Ustasa, making concentration camps and killing 25,000 Jews. Similar story in Latvia, again in the east, with the Latvian Auxiliary Security Police. They used volunteers to kill communists and 26,000 Jews, half the total population of Jews in that country. Resistance in Poland, then, you may know the film Defiance, which tells the story of the Bielski partisans. Four brothers escaping the Jewish ghetto in Poland, living in the forest, over 1,200 living there, surviving for 2 years, numerous attempts at sabotage against Nazi rulers. And it's also worth mentioning that there were significant numbers of Poles who rescued, fed, hid, up to almost 500,000 Jews with help from the Polish underground state. Contrasting story in Greece, where 3 prime ministers, under the influence of the Nazis, passed legislation including the formation of the 22,000 strong security battalion, who actively sought out and persecuted Greek communists there. A final overview of the course just there, and again putting it into context, and we'll finish off just by having a look at the assessment demands once more. So have a quick look at some of the exam questions you'll be facing. Give you a little bit more detail on how to answer each of these questions, but it's worth just noting the wording of them. So question 6 and 7 start you off with a question about a single source for question 6, and then 3 sources, or rather 1 interpretation, that is an account by an historian, and 2 sources for question 7. And then you have a choice over 2 questions for the essay style question 8 or 9. As always important to choose which one you're going to select very carefully. Just a little bit more specific advice on those. So for question 6, what can source A tell us about? What we're looking for is a very specific focus on whatever the key issues in the question. So as always, it's important to annotate the question first of all. You'd need to use quotes from the source or references to the source. So it might be a description, and it'd be ideal to add your own knowledge to explain that further. You'd also need to talk about the source itself, what its strengths are, what its limitations. That's things like looking at the NOP, the nature, origin and purpose. Who did it? When did they do it? Why did they do it? What does that tell us about the source? Question 7 asks you how useful are a variety of sources and interpretations. And again, there's a specific focus on the question that you're looking at. And again, you'll need to use some own knowledge. Now, the advice here is to take each one at a time and make sure you use specific detail from the source or the interpretation, so a quote or a description. Again, add your own knowledge, making sure you're staying focused on the question specifically being asked. Use the NOP of the source, and then you'll need a short overall judgment using the collection of the 3 as a whole to draw conclusions about how useful they are overall. It might be that they're missing something, or they've got a specific focus, or they're looking at it from a specific angle. So always look at specifically what the words are in the question. And then question 8 or 9 that'll be something you're very familiar with. They'll give you a statement. You have to talk about how far you agree with this view. The idea here is to begin with a short, maybe 2-line statement yourself. Then you've got a two-sided argument, although it's worth bearing in mind that they don't expect that to be necessarily balanced. It might be there's much more evidence for one side of the argument than the other. You're going to be using a peak style approach, so point, evidence, explain, and if you're going for the higher marks, complexity. And then you need to finish with a conclusion which gives your main reasons. And you'll always want to focus on the phrase how far.